All right, let's say our Asok B'divrei Torah blessing together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu asher kiddush mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has made us holy with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. All right, so tonight we're talking about Chanukah, which, since it's coming up starting Wednesday night, is timely. And we will go over the simple story and then the less simple story. But first, a joke. So the question is, who likes flowers but not religious oppression? And the answer is Judah Maccabee. Judah Maccabee.
I'm chuckling to myself.
Okay.
You have a subtle sense of humor, David.
When I'm screen sharing, I can't see, I can only see whoever's talking. So forgive me if I have to go by sound alone. All right, so the story of, Chanukah is a Jewish holiday that comes in the winter.
Yes.
And there are more twists and turns than are commonly known. I will also reiterate that while what I will be saying is on the screen, I will be pretty much saying it anyway, partly because sometimes there are people who call in and can't see the screen, and partly because people learn in different ways. Some learn through seeing, some learn through hearing. So if you are wondering why I'm just reading what is in front of you, this is why. All right, so we begin with the prequel. And here's the short story, of the short version of it. First, Alexander the Great and the Greeks conquer the Persian Empire. Then, after Alexander the Great dies, his generals split up Alexander's territory. Judea ends up belonging to Ptolemy along with Egypt. Eventually, the Seleucids conquered Judea and attached it to Syria. And then Antiochus IV outlaws Judaism in order to forcibly Hellenize Judea. And if you want the longer version, I have a source sheet that you can look at when I send this out tomorrow, God willing. Questions about this? Okay, seeing that, we move on. Okay, so here's the short version of the Chanukah story. First, the Syrian Greeks try to bring the religion to the village of Modi'in. Mattathias stops this. Then, Mattathias and his sons flee to the hills, and other Jews join them. Next, Judah Maccabee, one of Mattathias' sons, takes over and uses guerrilla warfare to drive the Syrian Greeks away. And finally, the Jews reclaim the second temple and clean it up from the pigs, from the statues of Zeus, and from the general mess. And that is it. The end. Questions about the short version of the Chanukah story, or in general about the Chanukah story? We'll get to the oil later.
Question, Dave. Do we know about how long the war of the Maccabees against the Syrian Greeks lasted?
Good question. So from the revolt of Mattathias to the cleaning of the temple was 3 years, 167 to 164 BCE. However, the longer version takes 25 years. And that is what we're going to be doing tonight in 45 minutes.
David?
Yeah.
Is Mattathias
Yes.
in Hebrew? Okay.
I have just a quick question also. Is Matthias a priest?
Yes, he is a priest. Good question.
Okay.
High priest.
He is not a high priest. There is a prayer, Al Hanisim, that refers to him as a high priest, but he is not actually a high priest.
Is that like an honorific?
It is probably giving the benefit of the doubt to the author of the prayer. I would say it is Kohen Gadol would be the great priest, because Kohen Gadol could either be the high priest or the great priest. And while it usually means the high priest, in this case, I'm going to translate it more accurately as the great priest.
I see. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other questions about this version, as they say, on one foot? All right, seeing none, we'll dive into the more complicated version of this. So we're going to start with the beginning of the rebellion. As the short version began, in 167 BCE, Syrian Greek troops attempted to impose Greek idolatry on the village of Modi'in, which is about 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem. They offer a reward to whichever Jew offers the first pagan sacrifice. The priest in residence, Matityahu in Hebrew, kills the volunteer and the Syrian Greek soldiers, and then he and his 5 sons flee to the Gothna Hills. Many Jews, especially the Hasidim, which are not the same as the modern Hasidim, joined them. And recognizing that the Syrian Greeks were willing to attack the Jews on Shabbat when the Jews wouldn't defend themselves, and that Jews had then gotten killed because of this, they decided that they would fight in self-defense on Shabbat, even if they weren't going to attack on Shabbat. Because as the Talmud says centuries later, in regards to Yom Kippur, it is better to break one Yom Kippur in order to observe many more Yom Kippurs than to die and not get to do any of them. By the end of the first year, Mattathias dies. So this is 166 BCE now. The oldest son is Eliezer, but the third son, Judah, is known as the best military leader. So he becomes the general. He gets the nickname the Maccabee. It's not his last name, it's just a nickname. Possibly as an acronym for the rallying cry, Mi chamocha be'elim Adonai, who is like you, God, among all that is worshipped, or possibly because he attacks the Syrian Greeks like a hammer. And it's related to the Hebrew word for hammer. As more Jews join, they attacked larger groups of Syrian Greek soldiers using guerrilla warfare. And even though they were outnumbered, because they were fighting in their home territory and for the right to practice their religion, they managed to survive the encounters. This leads to more military supplies being captured and more Jews willing to outwardly show their support. So this is kind of like the American Revolution. A small ragtag band of farmers takes on the mightiest army in the world at the time. And turns out they win, or at least convince the other army it's not worth it, and the other army goes away. So at this point, even though there has not yet been major battles, most of Judea is now under non-Hellenized Jewish control, except for the large towns and the walled cities. And then there's a song about Mattathias and his sons, and another song about Mattathias, if you would like to peruse those on your own time. Questions at this point?
Were the Syrian Greeks aided by like Hellenized Jewish leadership? Like, were they helping them, or was this kind of just the Syrian Greeks doing all this on their own?
Yeah. So the question is whether or not how the Hellenized Jews felt about the Syrian Greek army, and the Syrian Greek policies in general. And there was a split in opinion. The more moderate ones felt that it was well and good to bring Syrian Greek culture, but not mess with Jewish religion. And then there were other Hellenized Jews that were like, no, this is the way of the world. We want to fit in. These are generally the aristocratic Jews. We want to have good connections and maintain our social standing. And the way that you do that is by fitting in with the Greek leadership and political leadership of our territory. So there was a split of opinion. And this is why I asked you the question at the beginning about how you balance being yourself versus fitting in. Because for the Jews, they had to make that choice, and they fell along the spectrum of only Jewish, nothing Greek, to only Greek, nothing Jewish, except accident of birth, with many being somewhere in the middle towards one end or the other. So that is one of the themes of Hanukkah, and it continues to be an issue, both in general about ourselves as individuals, and then ourselves as Jews and other people of faith in a secular, non-Jewish society.
David, what is the source for the historic information?
The source for the historic information is the first book of Maccabees, which is written around that time. The second book of Maccabees, which is written a century or so later, and Josephus.
David?
Yeah.
The label Syrian Greek, how does that come up?
So that comes up, that's a good question. The term Syrian Greek comes up because if you think back to the prequel, the Greeks conquer Persia, and when Alexander the Great dies, one of his generals, Seleucus, gets Syria and points east. And so his empire becomes the Greek Empire in Syria, making them the Syrian Greeks. Sometimes referred to as Syrians, sometimes referred to as Greeks, but technically Syrian Greeks.
Thank
David, what do we make of the murder of a fellow Jew who is maybe about to commit idolatry?
So there is a larger discussion in the sources about the balance of the life of an individual versus the life and well-being of a community. And it goes back to the Bible. There's a story in Judges, I believe, which I need to look at more carefully, or possibly Samuel, where a town is being attacked because of a fugitive who was wanted by the opposing army, possibly the government, and I believe the town decides to hand them over, partly because they were doing wrong and partly because of the greater good of everybody else. And so every situation is a little different, but I would say here that the question might be different if it is a Jew committing idolatry in private versus a Jew committing idolatry in public and with the intention of whether it's the intention of the Jew or the intention of those encouraging the Jew, the intention of leading everybody else astray.
The 3 things we're not supposed to do, that we should die rather than do, includes that one, but that was codified later. I'm just curious. It reminds me of Zimri and Cosby's murder a little bit, sort of defiling. It's interesting. I assume there's commentary.
There probably is. I don't know what I'll find, but I'll look for it.
Just curious. Thank you. It's very disturbing, obviously.
Yes. Agreed. All right. Other questions about this first stage?
Yes. I just wanted to stress a point you made. First, you just seem to be describing 2 groups of Jews, sort of accommodationists and strict followers of Jewish law. And then you talked about a spectrum. And I think that it's definitely a spectrum with shades of opinion, and also views of different views as to the value of not merely accommodation and practicality, but as to the value of the Hellenistic culture, which was taking over so much and continued to do it, and as I'm sure you go on, and for the Jews as well. That's not really a question, so I take it back, I guess.
That is okay. It is an uplifting of a point. Thank you.
Dave, without getting too detour, I put a question in the chat, but it's more general.
Yes.
But, isn't the mission of conservative Judaism basically a response to your question of how to live Jewish lives within modernity and the diaspora?
Yes. So without spending an entire hour on this topic, but I'll give it a few seconds. After the emancipation of Western European Jewry in the 1800s, Jews were released from the ghettos starting in what became Germany eventually, in Central Europe, and were able to participate in general society. And so this led to many Jews saying that they wanted to just get rid of their Jewishness because it made them seem different, and Judaism seemed so different from the mainstream Christianity. And so questions arose about how do we as Jews interact with respond to modernity, which I guess was the same question that the Jews were asking in 167 BCE. And what do we do about the fact that some Jews are turning their back on Judaism? And so the first answer that was articulated was, we change Judaism so that it is more appealing and doesn't seem quite as different. And that became the Reform movement. And then the second answer became, we make some changes, like we'll do our sermons in the vernacular, but we don't like the changes that the Reform movement made. So we're not going to do very much changing, just tinkering around the edges. And that became the modern Orthodox movement. And then there's a backlash to that said, no, you can't even change anything. That became the ultra-Orthodox movement. And eventually, out of a backlash to what was happening in Europe and then eventually in the United States, there was what eventually became the conservative movement of too many changes, but we do need to make some changes. And so every group every branch of Judaism has wrestled with responding to modernity in its own way. So yes, excellent connection, Barry, between the modern branches of Judaism and the questions that the BCE were dealing with. All right, at this point, we're going to go on. So now we have Judah in control of the rebels, fighting against the mighty empire. This feels a bit like Star Wars. And so Judah's goal is to reclaim the temple. That's the first goal. Because what the Syrian Greeks had done to the temple was so offensive to Jewish sensibilities. In order to reclaim the temple, he needed to isolate Jerusalem so that the Syrian Greeks couldn't bring reinforcements and keep the Jews from getting to the temple. The Hellenized Jews of Jerusalem asked the Syrian Greeks to send in an army to attack the non-Hellenized Jews. So the governor in Samaria, which is a bit further north in the land of Israel, Apollonius, takes a force of Greeks, Macedonians, and they head down the ridge from Samaria towards Jerusalem. Judah's forces attack the Greeks, I guess, in an ambush at Labona, and Apollonius is killed, and Judah uses his sword thereafter. The rest of the loyalists to the Syrian Greeks flee, and this leaves more weapons for the guerrillas. There are 3 more attempts by the Syrians to connect with Jerusalem. They all fail. And then the 4th time, Saron, who is the military commander of Coel, Syria, so this is a broader region within the Syrian Empire, he takes his army, now we're talking about the regular army, and as they are heading up the slopes near Upper Beth Horon, Judah sends his forces rushing down the hills, and even though he has many fewer, he takes the enemy by surprise. The Syrians run away. Saron is dead. 800 of the Syrians are dead. And so Judah is able to continue working on isolating Jerusalem. At this point, Antiochus IV, the emperor who started this whole thing by putting in place the anti-Judaism decrees, realizes that this is not just some minor little thing going on, but one of his regions is trying to secede, and problematically, it is the region on the border with Egypt, the Ptolemies, they're also Greeks, but Syria and Greek have disagreed for millennia, and this is part of that disagreement. At the same time that he figures this out, which is 165 BCE, the Parthians, who are in, I believe, modern-day Iran, they also rebel against the Seleucids. So Antiochus goes to deal with the Parthians, and he appoints his general Lysias to do a couple of things. One, he is in charge in the capital, which is Antiochus this time. 2, he is the guardian of Antiochus IV's son, who will become Antiochus V when he becomes king. And 3, Lysias has to deal with the Jews. So Lysias sends Nicanor and Gorgias, along with 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, and Hellenized Jews and volunteers from other parts of the Syrian Empire and they are aware that they have way more people in their forces than the Jews have, the non-Hellenized Jews. So they're pretty sure they're going to win, and they invite slave dealers to come along and buy Jewish prisoners. And this will help raise funds for the Syrian Empire, which is having to pay tribute to the Romans after a Seleucid Roman battle that didn't go well for the Seleucids. So Nicanor decides that he is going to do something that Judah did, which is the surprise attack. And he sends Gorgias and 6,000 men, 5,000 infantry, 1,000 cavalry, to attack Judah at night at Mitzpah, which is where he knows that Judah is. However, because Judah has broad popular support, this means that he's got good intelligence. So he finds out about this plan, and he and his forces leave Mitzpah and come up on the Syrian Greek encampment at Emmaus from the south. So when Gorgias gets to Mitzpah, he sees that nobody's there. He figures they've all run away to the hills, and he sends his people to go looking in the hills for the Jews. He doesn't find any, so he goes back to Emmaus. However, there he finds that the camp is on fire, because Judah and his 3,000 men had attacked Nicanor's army at night, sent it fleeing, and burned the camp. They know that the other half is coming back, so they are in battle formation and ready to go. And Gorgias's army is so intimidated by the Jews being ready to do battle that even though they have more, they run away to what is still being called Philistia, which is effectively the Gaza Strip. Then, this not having gone well, Lysias tries again, but this time he's in charge of the army. So he has 60,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry. Judah has only 10,000 men in his forces. And as Lysias is coming up to Jerusalem from the south, Judah and his men meet them at Beth Sor, or Beit Sor in Hebrew, which is an area that has hills and ravines. And it's a good place to be attacking, not a good place to be defending, if you use the landscape to your advantage, which Judah does. And so Lysias loses 5,000 men and decides that he's going to go back to the capital for a year and try to get a better army. Because he has taken his army away, this means that Jerusalem is now open. Although there is a Syrian Greek garrison at the Acra, which is this fortress next to the Temple Mount. Here's a map of some of these places, so you can see where we're talking about. And this brings us to rededicating the temple. So, in 164, 3 years after the temple was defiled, the Jews get to go into Jerusalem, and at that point, the high priest who was appointed by the Syrian Greeks, Menelaus, leaves the city along with the other Jews who are on the Hellenistic side. Judah has some of his people keep the Syrian Greeks bottled up in the Acra, and then the Jews purify the second temple. This means, among other things, that they take down the altar that had pigs sacrificed on it. Although they weren't really sure what to do with this because it had been in Jewish use at one point and now it wasn't. And so they left it in a pile until someone could tell them what to do with it, which, as far as we know, nobody ever came along to do. And then they have an 8-day celebration. And it is 8 days, partly because they missed Sukkot during the fighting, and partly because Solomon's dedication of the first temple takes 8 days. But now you're thinking, what about the oil? Or maybe you're not, but I'm guessing that at least one of you is. So let's talk about the oil. According to First Maccabees, which is written shortly after the events occurred, The dedication ceremony is 8 days. It's not stated why, but it is possible that this is connected to the dedication of the first temple, which is the Haftorah, I believe, for Shabbat Chanukah 2.
8 days plus 8 days.
According to Second Maccabees, the dedication ceremony takes 8 days because Sukkot is 8 days. They hadn't been able to celebrate it during the fighting. According to Pesikta Rabbati, which is written about 600 years after all these events occur, given that First Maccabees says that the Syrian Greeks took away the menorah as part of their defiling of the temple, the Jews wanted to make a menorah, but they didn't have any. So they took 8 spears, stuck them in the ground, hollowed out the end, and used them as a makeshift menorah. According to the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, which is also written 600 years later, the Jews only found enough sealed oil to last 1 day, but a miracle occurred and it lasted 8 days until more oil could be produced. This is what many of us have been told. Now, it is noteworthy that this miracle was not noteworthy enough to make it into the contemporaneous accounts of books of Maccabees. Seems like this would be a big deal. Somebody ought to remember this. It is important to know that the rabbis who wrote the Babylonian Talmud did not like the Hasmoneans because their descendants had a fratricidal civil war, which led to Rome being invited into the land of Israel and eventually taking over. God willing, we'll talk about that next year. It is important to know that the rabbis who wrote the Babylonian Talmud did not like the Hasmoneans because they insisted on being both kings and high priests simultaneously. And according to Jewish tradition, there was supposed to be a separation of powers. The kings were supposed to go through the Davidic line from the tribe of Judah. The high priests were supposed to go through Aaron's line from the tribe of Levi. And in either case, it only went through the male side. So the Hasmoneans couldn't have been both, although they were priests. It is important to know that the rabbis who wrote the Babylonian Talmud did not like the Hasmoneans because they later killed many Pharisees, who were the forerunners of the rabbis. The rabbis also had an agenda bringing God into holidays where God was not as apparent, such as Purim. The rabbis also had an agenda of tamping down on militarism, so that there wouldn't be a rebellion against the Persians, like Mar Zutra's revolt against the radical Persians who were oppressing Christians, conservative Persians, and Jews in 470 CE. One way of making all this work, though, is to keep in mind that if Pesikta Rabbati is correct, that the Jews were using a makeshift menorah, then 1 day's worth of oil for the regular menorah could easily last 8 days in a menorah that doesn't hold as much oil. So that is one way of doing what the Talmud likes to do, which is saying, you are right and you are also right. How are they both right? You are also right. All right. Questions up to this point?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so talk about menorahs. All my life I learned that it's a menorah. As I started teaching at my school, they said that we should teach the kids it's a Chanukah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the Chanukah has 8 branches, right? And the menorah does not, including the shamash for the Chanukah. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah. So menorah is the Hebrew word for lamp. In the Torah, Aaron is told, maybe Moses, is told to make a menorah, 7 branches for the tabernacle. This goes into the temple eventually. 7-branch lamp. In modern Hebrew, menorah just means lamp. The Hanukkah menorah, the Hanukkah lamp, has 8 branches, and then because you aren't supposed to use the light,
8 cups.
Thank you. 8 cups, also now 8 branches usually, but not strictly necessary. Because you're not supposed to use the light of the Chanukah, the Chanukah menorah, there's a 9th one called the Shamash, which lights the other ones. So it is technically correct that the Chanukah menorah is called a Chanukah. That being said, Chanukah has that pesky sound, and so many people find it easier to say menorah. On the one hand, they're not wrong because a menorah is a lamp. On the other hand, it's not technically right because in the story of Hanukkah, the menorah that was lit in the temple as part of the dedication ceremony had 7 branches.
So, David,
yes,
presumably the initial Hanukkahs that were produced were used oil and not candles.
Yes.
And if they used oil, the 9th candle could not have been used to light all the other all the other oil pots. So why do we use the 9th candle today to light the candles?
Can I offer an observation at this point? If
Sure.
I may? At some point in history, we didn't have candles yet, or at least they weren't described in our liturgy at that point. It was a cup of oil with a wick.
Mm-hmm.
So it serves the function of the candle, but it's not a freestanding stick. It's a cup with liquid oil in it and a wick that burns like that. So, and therefore the branches and whatnot, as opposed to freestanding candles. We have all kinds of Chanukah that sometimes they stand individually and all that. So it's deceiving to think back in these days that it's the same kind of candle that we use today. That's I yield to David. I just wanted to interject that part that wasn't always like we do it.
Correct. So, Herb, to your question, whatever was being used to light the other wicks that were in the oil could not be one of the 8 wicks. However they solved that problem, it had to be something separate. Does that help?
I'm not sure, but I'm not going to belabor the point tonight.
Great, thank you.
Both of you.
May I chime in?
Please.
Unlike Shabbat candles that are supposed to be used for not bumping into things, Hanukkah candles are pure, or Hanukkah lamps are purely for celebration and proclaiming the miracle. You can't use them for anything. That's why we light an additional shamash as the one that we can use to avoid bumping into tables. And since we can use it, the easiest way to prove that this is a candle that we're using is to use it to light the others.
Hmm.
Okay.
I don't follow that argument.
Yeah, it's a question.
The shamash is a utility light. How do you prove it's a utility light? Use it to light the non-utility lights.
But it's not supposed to be a utility light.
The shamash is supposed to be the only utility light.
Because because the candles are lit after dark, and in a pre-electricity time, you need something to give light after dark so that you're not bumping into things.
Well, but in modern times, you could use a match to light the other 8 candles. Why would you use the 9th candle instead?
Okay, jumping
like I say, I don't belabor the point tonight, but I'm still not quite clear.
Tradition.
I defer to Minhag.
All right, Minhag, custom. And that is probably the answer. By the time that matches came around, we had traditions already set. Okay, at this point, we're going to zip through the rest of this, probably in shortened form. Okay, so now that the temple has been reclaimed, the towns that are outside of Judea don't like the Jews, and they don't like the fact that the Jews have been successful. This goes on, thank you. This goes on throughout Jewish history, actually. And so they send soldiers and money to help the Syrian Greeks, and they attack the Jews living in their cities. For instance, they drowned 200 Jews in their city. And other cities also did such things. Now, for 2 years, Lysias was busy acting as regent for Antiochus V, because he was only 9 at the time and 10 when he took over. So during that time, Simon and Judah take their forces to the other cities in the area to effectively get them to behave. And by that, they mean, you stop helping our enemies and you leave us alone, and we won't cause problems for you. Some of the Jews prefer to move into Judea. Others prefer to stay where they are, now that their neighbors are behaving nicer to them. These cities, this move was not made by Judah to put more territory into Judea, merely to protect the Jews living outside of Judea. So here's a map where you can see all the different places where people are going in more detail. All right. So in 163, now that the neighbors are behaving better, Judah starts trying to kick out the Syrian Greek garrison in the Acra next to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Lysias brings the biggest army yet, 100,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and 32 armored war elephants who have archers and wooden towers. This is some... Indeed. This is something the Jews have not had to deal with yet. Lysias forces a fight on open ground near Beth Sicaria, and the armored elephants, maddened by wine and mulberry juice and pushed forward by their drivers, do a lot of damage. One of Judah's brothers, Eliezer, thinks that he sees the elephant that Antiochus V is on. So in order to bring down that elephant, he finds the one spot that the elephant is not armored, which is under it, gets under it, kills the elephant, but the elephant falls on top of him and kills him too. So with these sorts of numbers, the Maccabees lose the battle and retreat behind the newly repaired walls of Jerusalem. Lysias lays siege to the city. However, fortunately for the Jews, a rival of Lysias was attacking Antioch, the capital. So Lysias settles matters. He offers religious freedom, but the Syrians are still in charge. Most of the Jews say, great, that's what we wanted. We're okay with you being in charge. Judah doesn't trust that the Syrian Greeks aren't going to interfere again, but he's outvoted, so he and his forces leave, and Alcimus becomes the new high priest put in place by the Syrian Greeks.
Is he in the same line as the Hasmoneans, or is he not? He's gone. He's out.
Alcimus?
Yes.
No, he's a Hellenized Jew.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So then Demetrius I kills Lysias and Antiochus V, who is his cousin, and Alcimus asks Demetrius to send an army to get Judah because Alcimus had started oppressing the Jews and killing a lot of them, and so this got Judah more support. Demetrius sends Nicanor back with 3,000 men. Judah ambushes them. Nicanor tries again. Judah ambushes them at Adassa. Nicanor is the first killed. And this becomes a minor Jewish holiday, the Feast of Nicanor, on the 13th of Adar. There's a link if you want to learn more.
And a gate.
Yes. Judah sends a delegation to Rome, which doesn't like the Seleucids, and the Romans declare that they are friends of the Judeans. Demetrius then sends his best commander, Bacchides, to Judea with the crack army unit of the Syrian Greeks. Most of Judah's men desert because they are concerned about this. Judah decides to fight instead of using guerrilla tactics, and he is killed. The revolution, another map for you. The revolution then, then passes to the leadership of Jonathan, who is Judah's brother. By 156, Jonathan picks up enough support that he threatens Jerusalem again. The Hellenized Jews ask Bacchides to come back. Simon, another brother, mans the defenses against the siege that the Syrian Greeks have put in place. Jonathan goes out and harasses the supply lines. Bacchides decides that this is turning into a quagmire. He turns on the Hellenizers in Jerusalem, kills a lot of them. Jonathan then offers to negotiate, and he basically gets to set up an opposition government. There's intrigue in Syria between Demetrius and a pretender to the throne. Jonathan plays them off each other and gets to become the governor of Jerusalem and Judea. However, one of the army generals doesn't trust that, or doesn't like that Jonathan is getting more independence, and he offers to turn over a city to Jonathan. Jonathan comes to accept it, and then Jonathan is killed. Control, so this is 143 now. Control then goes to Simon. Simon convenes the Great Assembly, which is mentioned in Pirkei Avot that Simon was the last of the members of the Great Assembly. That would be this Simon, Simon the Maccabee. They say, okay, you're not in the high priest line, you're not in the kingship line, but for now, you can have both of them until someone can straighten things out. He negotiates with the Syrian Greeks to give support to one side, fighting against the other side in exchange for complete independence, and starts to issue coinage. Finally gets the Acra to surrender. And is well liked by almost everybody except for the Jews who go to Qumran and write the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they refer to Simon as the wicked priest. The Romans and the Spartans affirm the right of the Jews to live in peace in their land and say, we are friends of you. The last strong Seleucid king, Antiochus VII, tries to assert authority. Simon sends his sons to fight, but so they win. Antiochus tries to remove Simon another way, has Simon's son-in-law assassinate him and two of his sons. John Hyrcanus, Simon's son, manages to escape that, survive it, and he becomes the next leader. At this point, this takes us out of the time of the Maccabees and into the Hasmoneans, and God willing, we will talk about that next year.
Wait, so Simon and one of the sons was murdered, but John got away?
Yes, Simon and two of his sons are murdered, but John Hyrcanus gets away, and he becomes the next leader. So I'm going to stop recording.
Wow.
Love